How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 11th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the 6th section of Ferdinand de Saussure's course in General Linguistics, titled Geographical Linguistics. This part of the book is quite a bit shorter than the last two sections on diachronic and synchronic linguistics, so we should be able to finish it all in one video. In terms of the section itself, it's made up of 4 chapters. Firstly, concerning the diversity of languages. Secondly, complications of geographical diversity. Thirdly, causes of geographical diversity. And finally, but not at all leastly, spread of linguistic waves. He begins concerning the diversity of languages by stating that he is now moving from an internal linguistics to an external linguistics. If you don't remember or didn't watch it, we looked at the division between them in the second video on the introduction. To summarize, everything that involves language but doesn't impact its so-called inner organism is external. Everything geographical is in this domain. Going back to the text, Saussure says that the most striking thing about the study of language is its diversity. In particular, the differences we see passing from one country to another, or even from one region to another. Unlike divisions in time, which we don't often really acknowledge day to day, divisions in space are easily graspable by everyone, he says. It's thus that geographical diversity was one of the first ever linguistic observations made, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Concerning diversity itself, Saussure describes 2 different types of differences: absolute diversity and diversity within related groups. With the first of the 2 types of diversity, linguists can go about studying it through the comparison of the 2 unrelated languages. For example, Chinese and English, or Arabic and Japanese. This study is in a way limited, since it is reined in by the limited phonetic inventories that make up any language. This is in contrast to the second type of diversity, which offers an unlimited field for comparison. For example, Greek is far from Sanskrit, whilst the latter is close to Hindi. This brings us quickly along to the second chapter, Complications of Geographical Diversity, split into 2 subsections. It starts out with coexistence of several languages at the same point. Saussure saying this:
Up to this point, geographical diversity has been presented in its ideal form. There were as many territories as there were different languages.
What this means is that previously, his description of diversity rested on the idea that languages all have their distinct territories which don't overlap. However, in practice, this couldn't be farther from the truth. Firstly, there's the fact that events lead to the mingling and interpenetration of 2 or more languages, such as in the case of the Norman conquest of England, where French and English co-mingled. Secondly, there's the case where languages, although separated out geographically, overlap in the same political territory, like in the case of Switzerland with its German, French, Italian, and Romansh. What concerns us, though, in this chapter is that languages can exist side by side without intermingling. In Saussure's eyes, this happens frequently, such as in the case of newcomers forcing their language onto an indigenous language, as occurs in colonization. Take the imposition of English and Afrikaans on Zulu and Sotho in South Africa, for example. Additionally, it can occur more peacefully, like in the case of traditionally nomadic groups like the Roma. This brings us to the second subchapter, literary language and local idiom. What he's looking at here is the meddling role played by the standardized literary languages. In Saussure's eyes, a language originally has only dialects, which branch out periodically into new languages, with no one dialect ruling the others. However, when the society that speaks that language advances to a certain point, a dialect is privileged and turned into something of a standard that all other dialects are compared to. Due to how common of an occurrence this is, notice that there may seem to be just a regular characteristic of language. However, nothing could be further from the truth. The literary language is an import wherever it expands out from its original geographical location, imposing itself on other dialects. It's important not to allow it to obscure geographical diversity. This brings us to the penultimate chapter, titled Causes of Geographic Diversity. It's split into 4 sections, the first being time, the basic cause. As the title suggests, this deals with time as a cause of geographic diversity. He makes the observation that diversity within languages can, at the end of the day, be traced back to linguistic unity. For example, just look at the Romance languages and Latin. French, Spanish, and Romanian may be separate languages today, but that wasn't always the case. Time creates diversity. To demonstrate this point, he offers the example of a few speakers living on one island being transplanted onto another. Eventually, he says, the languages of the people on the second island will diverge from that of those on the first. He offers this diagram to represent how those changes occur, using the example of A becoming B or C. It isn't space alone, though, that causes this change. There isn't some magical property of a second island that morphs language. No, rather it is time as well that has a role to play. The geographical division just made it so that diachronic phonetic change occurred slightly differently on the two islands. This takes us to the second subchapter, effect of time on continuous territory. It begins with the example of a unilingual territory like Gaul in 450 AD, where Latin was the language of the land, asking what will happen as time goes on. The first thing is that due to how language is constantly changing and shifting around, it will inevitably no longer be the same after a certain period of time. The second is that evolution will vary from zone to zone of a territory, leading to an evolution that looks something a bit like this, instead of something like this. Saussure goes on to state that differentiation through time isn't exactly as clear-cut as it seems, that it progresses with two main characteristics. In his words, the first is that
evolution takes the form of successive and precise innovations that include as many partial facts as could be enumerated, described, and classified according to their nature.
And the second is that every innovation occurs in, or to use his phrasing, embraces a certain part of a territory. This can happen across the entirety of that territory, but more commonly occurs in only a specific zone. To demonstrate this, he offers this diagram. One part of a territory underwent a vowel shift, whereas the rest didn't. An additional sub-characteristic is that these changes often don't fall across the same lines, demonstrated by yet another diagram. This is the same territory as vowel shift, just with different zones. With this out of the way, he now turns to the question of what is the result of differentiation through time. The result is that, over time, the differences in dialects will increase to the point of being incomprehensible to those who once shared a language. Additionally, it means that a speaker from one area will be unable to understand the same language, as hard as it is to define that, a few hundred years later. With this, we get to the next subchapter, dialects have no natural boundaries. Here, he's critical of a prevailing practice at the time, which divided up dialects neatly into specific territories, demonstrated by this map. The reason why is because of what we discussed in the last subsection. Linguistic change doesn't adhere to borders. It cuts across territory in unpredictable ways. This leaves us with two choices, he says.
We may define a dialect by the totality of its characteristics, which involves choosing one point on the map and encompassing only the regional speech forms of a single locality. Or we may define a dialect by one of its characteristics and simply map the spread of this characteristic, which obviously is an artificial procedure since it corresponds to no dialectical reality.
Turning now to the borders of dialects, Saussure chooses to describe them as innovating waves in order to emphasize just how blurry they are. He uses this diagram to represent them. This shows the overlapping nature of the two zones. He ends the section by defining his understanding of dialects. More than just linguistic, dialects are just as much social, political, and religious, veiling their unstable and nebulous nature. This leads directly on to the last section of the chapter, which bears the title, Languages Have No Natural Boundaries. The main takeaway of this subchapter is that just like with dialects, it's difficult to tell where one language ends and another begins. In fact, Saussure states, it's difficult to even tell dialects from languages. There's nothing really objective about their division. With this, he ends chapter 3 and begins the last chapter of a whole part, titled Spread of Linguistic Waves. It's made up of 3 subsections, with the first being titled Intercourse and Provincialism. An interesting tidbit about the title is that, despite the notes being in French, Saussure used the English word intercourse in his lecture. He defines provincialism and intercourse as 2 forces that work constantly in opposing directions. Provincialism refers to individualism, whilst intercourse refers to communication between different people. The former acts to keep a small linguistic community together around their own quirks, leading to potentially infinite change. However, it's reined in by the latter, which essentially sacrifices that infinite change for legibility. Intercourse describes bringing strangers into the village, groups together in the army, and everything else that causes people to unify and communicate together. It functions in two different ways. To begin with, there's the negative side of intercourse, preventing innovation by wiping it out wherever it appears. Then there's the positive side. It promotes unity by spreading an innovation, pushing for its collective adoption. It's for this second way that Saussure uses the term wave to describe a dialect's borders, intercourse adding similarly to a flood. The next section is titled The Two Forces Reduced to One. His main contention in this subchapter is that if we focus on a specific small point, like a village, we can see that every fact can be split into either intercourse or provincialism, with no overlap, but that this doesn't hold true on a grander scale. Being Swiss, Saussure uses the example of cantons. On one hand, intercourse may unify one under a single dialect. However, provincialism can then separate that canton from and put it in distinction with other cantons around it. This poses something of a problem, since it makes telling the two forces apart difficult. However, in Saussure's words,
in studying linguistic evolutions, we can disregard the individualistic force. That is, we can consider it as the negative side of the unifying force.
This is because intercourse lends itself to study, unlike the dividing force of provincialism. Finally, we get to the final subchapter of the entire section, linguistic differentiation on separate territories. Saussure begins by stating that three things must be realized before studying a language which is evolving on two different territories. The first is that even in a continuous area which speaks one language, change is not always the same across the entire territory. As we saw earlier, it gets split up in waves. The second thing is that not all innovation spread, which leads to the last thing. Geographical connectedness does not mean that changes don't endlessly occur. This is why, from the point of view of differences, it doesn't particularly matter whether or not the territory on which people speak the language is continuous or discontinuous, since change occurs everywhere. However, from the point of view of solidarity or intercourse, it's a little different. The intercourse as a force can't rein in individualistic change when languages are divided, or at least not in the same way. What this means is that an isolated language, although it may be able to keep its internal solidarity, quickly branches off from that of another territory. Intercourse can't keep them from drifting apart. This concludes Spread of Linguistic Waves, the last chapter of a section on geographical linguistics. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll look at the section concerning retrospective linguistics. Until then, bye.